When you're ready, folks, we've got a quorum. So we are here for our October policy meeting. It is still October, isn't it? So welcome. I'm Christine Kushner. I'll be chairing the meeting, and we've got committee members, Vice Chair Jim Martin and Vice Chair of the Board, Lindsay Mahaffey, which is part of our quorum, and Ms. Karen Carter is online and attending virtually. I have heard from Ms. Cash that she's had an urgent matter come up, is not able to join us. So in deference to everyone's time, we'll go ahead and get started at 3 o'clock. And we need to have a hard stop at 5 o'clock due to some other scheduling. So we've got a beefy agenda, so good to be here and to see everyone. In opening, looking at the agenda, just want to let you know that in talking with Dr. Crane and staff, we are the parking for students and visitors, policy 6325, which was going to be part of our policy migration. We got some late feedback on that, so we are going to pull that from the agenda today. Mr. Smith gets respite, but we will bring that forward to our next policy meeting. So we still have a lot remaining in our technology responsible use revision and updates 3225, and then we have a group of transportation policies that are replacing Wake County policies that we had, but trying to align it with North Carolina School Board Association policies. So we have parsed that out to align with the School Board Association. So that is why we're bringing this forward as a package of policies for the second half of our meeting. But today we're going to go ahead and start after approving the minutes with technology responsible use. So thank you, Ms. Gaddis, for being here front and center with Dr. Crane and Dr. Gardner. So without further ado, can I hear a motion to, I hope everyone reviewed the minutes, and is there a motion to approve the minutes from the September policy meeting?
Second.
There's a motion and a second. All those in favor, any discussion? All those voted aye. The minutes are approved. And thank you, Superintendent Moore, for being here, as well as our counsel, Jonathan Blumberg. Thank you, sir. And Ms. Kinney is keeping us straight online and with minutes. So thank you, Ms. Kinney. And Ms. Heather Scott has joined us, and Mr. Hegarty. So we are raring to go. So our first policy up for discussion is 3225, technology responsible use, both the policy and the RNP. And if you recall, this came to us in June, and we had a lively discussion then. And Ms. Gaddis has gone back with some of the feedback and is here to present the current revision. So thank you for being here.
Good afternoon, Committee Chair Kushner, Superintendent Moore, and board members. Today I bring to you another round of changes to Policy 3225, Technology Responsible Use. Just a quick piece of background just to remind you that one of the reasons for the revisions to this policy is that we are collapsing Policy 3013, which was employee acceptable use, and so we've now completely collapsed. So this will remain, this will end Policy 3013. And so a lot of the revisions you'll see today are things that we have taken from 3013 and put into this policy. You'll also notice that the change in the title is not student technology responsible use, but also just technology responsible use for both staff and students. So, all right, we're ready to go ahead and get started. So first change that you'll note, and I'm going to put my glasses on so I can actually see what I'm talking about today, which is helpful. In the second paragraph, third sentence, you'll see that we've added this applies to non-students who are expressly authorized by the Wake County Public School System to include Board of Ed, contractors, consultants, and temporary workers. So if you are working for Wake County Public Schools, this policy falls to you as well. And this was something that was taken from Policy 3013. Also, at the end of the opening, you'll see the accountability for who is responsible. So administrators and supervisors are responsible for enforcing the policy for employees, and school administrators and staff are responsible for enforcing for all students at the school for which they work. There is a typo there. We have caught that. So just to let you know, our apologies. We have two typos in here that we caught after they went out. So
I was just curious on that point. That seemed to me like kind of an obvious statement about who does the enforcement. And I know we've taken a lot of those sort of if it's obvious who does the enforcement out of policy, so I wasn't sure whether that statement really should stay or was one of those that was kind of it's policy, it's obviously the administration who would be responsible.
I know that staff erred on the side of carrying over your existing language from the other policy and putting it here, but it's absolutely, in my opinion, optional language. And I do know that in most of your policies, you don't say, and this is who's going to do this and this is going to do that, because, once you start doing it, then the question is, why don't you do that in every policy? So this seems to be perfectly optional language and not necessarily language that moves the ball much, but it's up to you all.
I guess my question is, Ms. Gaddis and Dr. Crane, was that something that the board specifically asked for in our last review of this policy?
No, this was
Okay.
one of the pieces that we realized we had missed from 3013 that we brought over.
Okay, thank you.
So no, this was not a requested add.
Well, and I would personally like to keep this in because I want to make sure it's administrators and our staff who are regulating this instead of, say, an SRO or someone else coming into the school. So I would rather keep it specific. But that's just me. Feedback.
I was going to recommend getting rid of it, but I also see your point. I hadn't really thought. I mean, school SROs don't have any policy authority, so I understand your language aspect of it, but that would be, right now, only school personnel have policy authority anyway.
Well,
But
SROs
I hear
can-
what you're saying.
Yeah, and they can gain access to student records, so I want to make sure that, that was another question I had, and we're getting a little ahead, because I did want you to go over the revisions first and then
I'm sorry.
get to questions, but that's okay.
Oftentimes we
I
hit
just-
them as they come.
That's right, and
Yeah.
it reminds me to ask, whether this is considered, is the use of technology a student record or not, and would it be protected the same way student records are? So just tuck that away, Ms. Gaddis, and we'll get to that. But,
Absolutely.
But I would just advocate for keeping that language in, just to be specific and clear that it's school administrators.
Ms. Kirshner, another thought associated with this is that because technology and the use of it is district-wide, both at central services and at school, its own, it's just not central services and schools, that this delineates the employees supervised by administrators and their respective supervisors, whether it be a senior director or director, and also refers to school-based administrators. So it could be that's why it's a carryover from previous, delineating it that way.
I'm going to say, just quickly on that one note, to that point, should it say school-based administrators? Because I would suggest you're a school administrator, for example. And I think what I just heard is you're talking about school-based administrators.
We could certainly add that language if Marlo's
That was the
in
intent.
agreement, Marlo.
Sure.
Well, but wait, because, so the policy doesn't apply to district office-based staff?
It does. I think.
Well, then you've just said it's now just school-based administrators.
Second sentence, school-based.
The second sentence is what I think Dr.
School
Mark was saying.
administrators and staff.
For
All
students.
students in
plus
which they work.
school-based.
Okay, well, so my question but goes back to this idea that this is beyond simply school students and school-based employees, and if it is central office staff, where we're extending it up here to contractors, consultants, and temporary workers. So now you've expanded the pool of people covered by the policy, but you don't have any responsibility down here. If you're creating a new section about who's responsible for supervision and enforcement of the policy, you've extended the pool without delineating any supervision or enforcement, which you didn't have to do when you didn't specify it. But now if you are specifying it, you've specifically said, here's this other group that's covered, and we've got group A that covers the students, group B that covers staff, and nobody for the third part. And so I just wonder if by expanding it, we've also left a hole.
And I will just mention, Mr. Hagerty, that contractors, consultants, and temporary workers are attached to a supervisor in the district. So, for instance, I have a series of contractors that work for me. I am responsible for the work that they do, and I'm also responsible for this policy and those folks. So I don't know that it necessarily expands beyond that realm, but I certainly see your point in that as well.
So I guess in that first sentence, all employees they supervise, would you want to expand that? And I guess, Mr. Blumberg, it might be a question for you in terms of definition of an employee.
I don't think a contractor is an employee. I think that's an important distinction to uphold for a lot of reasons. I think your point is well taken. Again, it's a board call about whether to keep this language, but once you start delineating, then it raises the question of, well, I guess nobody's delineated to supervise this group or that group, even though I think staff would know
Yeah.
that they're supposed to. So, I mean, I think the board in general has tried to avoid, hey, make sure you put this in this person's job description. I know that was an area that the board sort of took out as well, or the superintendent, may do an R&P on this. Well, everybody knows the superintendent can do that, so the board's generally taken those out. And I do have some, if you asked me, would I have a preference? Legally, my preference would be not to have it in there just because you've started to delineate, but you haven't covered everybody that's covered by the policy in delineating, but ultimately, it's the board's call.
Thank you.
Ms. Mahaffey?
I think if this is something that can be put in R&P, I think that might be better, because, there are some donuts, we're hearing donut holes, or just holes, I guess. Guess maybe I'm also hungry. Sure. And it sounds like, Ms. Gaddis, there already is a procedure in place on how you supervise your contractors. So it seems to me that putting this into R&P would be a better place for it than having to list all of the, if this, then that, if you're a contractor, then this, if you're a, this,
And our staff is not opposed to taking out both additions here. We just wanted to make sure we pulled over everything from the past. So if we want to take this out completely, we are okay with that as well.
Okay.
And the addition they're talking about is just that last sentence.
Just the last
paragraph in the preamble. It's
preamble.
not the
Yes.
second paragraph addition.
Well, but I
Right.
am going to advocate for it. I would like for it to be an RNP because I want to be clear on who's responsible and if it needs more language.
All right?
So to that point, and I agree and appreciate that, but I think we might even want to have an overarching statement that particularly says enforcement of this policy for students should only be by school system staff, and possibly even school-based staff. Because that way we can be explicit about the purpose that you're talking about.
Okay. And leave it in policy? I would,
No, I think
Put in
NRP makes
RP.
a lot more sense.
okay.
But in that statement, just be explicit that interactions with students is by school-based staff.
Okay. All right?
I do think, just as a final point on that, the board is establishing policy and leaving to the superintendent to implement that policy.
Yeah.
And so R&P is the implementation of it and who would do what. So that line seems to be honored by the change.
Thank you, Mr. Blumberg. Any further feedback on that piece? So it seems like consensus is to move that to the R&P section. Thank you, Ms. Gaddis.
Thank you. We're going to move to B on page 2, under number 1. One of the things that was missing from policy 3013, and here's where another one of our typos was, so I apologize. It's approved personal use does not include the use of taglines or signature additions. And so we brought that back over.
And can you describe what a tagline or signature addition is, what that means for our staff and students?
It could be a quote, it could be a picture. We are actually working with our friends at Tharrington and HR to look at defining better what personal use is. And so as part of that work, we're going to be providing some better insight into what is allowable in that realm.
Okay. So in that, I would think that would result in some guidance to staff as to what kind of quotes or pictures they can put at the end of their emails.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a good idea. Ms. Mahaffey?
And just to be clear, because we're talking about, anything from the technology being software, hardware, or, something in the cloud, which I think is still covered under software, but correct
It
me if
is.
I'm wrong. Okay. So if I'm using my, Chromebook at home, which is my school-issued device, but accessing my personal email, this would not apply to my personal email. It would only be my school at
Correct.
wcpss.net or at students okay,
Yes, ma'am.
just making sure.
Yes.
That's clear as
As
we're.
with my personal email, I can send anything with the tagline. With my work email, I cannot.
Right, thank you. I'm
Welcome.
making sure we have it clear here, just because there's not always
Yes, ma'am.
the delineation. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Gaddis.
Well, I want to clarify that because I think I found the language still a little bit unclear because there were several times about when connected to a network. Like I raised the last time we looked at this, I would wager that most people don't know what network they're connected to. I think there's a big difference between like using your Wake County email account or your Chromebook or whatever, or maybe it's your hotspot, and having something come from, right? If it comes from a Wake County email address, that's one thing. But if you just happen to be on your computer, using a hotspot, using a network, who knows where, a lot of the language still says that falls completely under this policy. That's where I have a little bit of
Well-
question. But from the answer to your last question, it sounded like it's
So-
not personal use if you just, are checking your personal email on, and I guess
So-
that's the occasional use.
Yeah, I think what I was answering was Ms. Mahaffey's question around taglines.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was
Fair enough.
thinking personal account versus work account, and that's how I answered that question.
Okay.
So would it be more clear if, approved personal use does not include the use of taglines or signature additions to this?
WCPSS email?
Yes.
Sure.
Get that, please?
I have approved personal use does not include the use of taglines or signature additions on WCPSS email.
Is email fully encompassing, are there, you go ahead, Mr. Hager.
So now I'm confused by that. So that sounds like you're saying that there is no approval of personal use of WCPSS email?
No.
Or, so what is that saying that?
Sure. So I'll try to use something fairly innocuous. So if I want to go pack at the end of my emails, I cannot do that on my Wake County email. I could do it on my personal Gmail.
And that's good. That's what I was hoping the policy was.
Yes.
But then I didn't understand that with the wording that we had here with the suggestion.
Okay.
And so that's why I was sort of asked to read it back, because I guess hearing it and processing it, what I heard didn't sound like what you're describing. And it might have just been a fault of my interpretation. But that's why I was asking if it could be read back.
Well, I'm asking because, right now my signature is, if this is the policy that we're passing, I need to change the signature on my Wake County email because it says the mission and vision from our strategic plan. So, right.
So that would be Wake County business. So we've got to determine, as part of this memo, what is allowable and what is not. That would not be considered technically a personal tagline. That would be a Wake County tagline.
I see.
And I would see that as appropriate because
Yes.
you're reinforcing Wake County's consensus work.
Right.
And the mission, mission, or if a teacher puts a schedule or their team name, or I think if they're at a school, at Wake Forest or Apex High School, and they say, "Go Cougars," I think that would be acceptable. But Mr. Blumberg, Ms. Scott.
I was just going to say, but a music teacher could not have like a quote from a composer?
I think that's what still has to be determined at this point.
Okay.
So let me just, you guys are pointing out, you all are pointing out a lot of the examples that make this an incredibly challenging area. That once you start to open the door for expression, then where do you close the door? And you certainly don't want to be in the picking and choosing of viewpoints that are acceptable or not. And so, I mean, I think that this is carrying over from your existing policy that was basically designed to just say that there wouldn't be any personal taglines or, you know, or signature blocks, so there wouldn't be any expression beyond that. It would be plain. This is your signature, and you would go from there. If you were to establish any exceptions to that, the starting point would be what is essentially government speech, where you all have already determined this is our strategic plan, or this is the mission of the district, and you could put in there the exceptions would include, and without opening the whole door, you know, you can state the mission of the district, because that's government speech and that would be allowable. So you would have to decide where you're going to sort of open and close that door. As you open it, it becomes more and more challenging. Could you open it and include government speech? Yes. But once you get into this quote from this composer, and then we're left having to decide whether that seems acceptable, but that now seems really a viewpoint, and that seems like a uber, you know, viewpoint, and now we're essentially engaging in viewpoint discrimination. And so we're trying to avoid that with this policy and that change, which is a carryover from existing policy.
So
Thank you.
Isn't part of the issue here, right, most of the quotes and anything that somebody would want to add, if it's in the body of the text and relevant to what you're sending, you can send it. But isn't the issue here the taglines and signatures, because that gets added to every piece of communication,
Correct.
whether relevant or not. So it's not really limiting your speech to give the quote from the composer. It's just, you know, if you're talking about, you know, a parent's bus schedule or a student's bus schedule, you don't need to bring in the stuff about the composer. I think that's the intent of this, isn't it?
Yes, you are correct, sir.
But it doesn't limit you being able to have that speech.
So making sure if it's a quote from the strategic plan or your school's mission vision or, you know, go Cougs versus live, laugh, love.
Mr. Hegarty,
So,
add to that.
and again, I'm not trying to, I think I understand the intent of the policy and what you're trying to accomplish, but I go back to my question, which is, I don't understand what this sentence means because of how it's worded.
So do you have a suggestion for
So
a better way of
I
wording?
want to make sure that I have this right because of the typo. It should say, approved personal use does not include the use of taglines or signature additions. Is that
Correct.
right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, but then in the previous paragraph, it says, you know, like, I'm looking for the term approved personal use. And so I can't tell if this is saying that the use of taglines and signature additions are not subject to approval or will not be approved, can't be used. I can't tell from this line whether
Perfect.
it's saying they're prohibited or they're not regulated.
Yes, my very brilliant colleague over here has a suggestion for a change, which I think is good. And it might just be that we change that to WCPSS email should not include the use of taglines or signature additions.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's much more clear. And again, I'm not trying to weigh in and say they should or they shouldn't. I just couldn't determine whether approved personal use,
Yep, nope, I appreciate
what
that.
that meant.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Repeat that.
I'll happily
Brilliant
do that.
colleague. Thank
That
you.
last sentence, we're going to change to Wake County Public School System email should not include the use of taglines or signature additions.
So I concur with that, with the potential exception is, is email too narrow, right? What about text? What about Facebook? What about any other modes of communication? I mean, there are so many that are exploding right now. So I almost wonder, you know, are we talking about email or other electronic forms of communication?
So
Then can you put it on your letterhead if you send old-fashioned snail mail? I mean, I think what we're talking about is, you know, in general email or other general correspondence. I mean, I don't know what I'm looking.
Sure.
It just reminds me of how pagers stayed in our policy for, I mean, pagers came out of our policy, I think, 2 years ago.
So would it be better to say WCPSS communication should not include the use of taglines or signature additions?
And
I
is
don't
it
know that that's the
all-
right word either.
And it's all taglines and signature additions or personal taglines? Or,
Yeah.
Because if it's,
and, right. Right.
All right.
Well,
And
that
is
was going to be
personal
my
the right
question.
word?
Your professional credentials should be fine for a
Yes,
signature line,
correct,
for example.
Correct.
Yeah.
National Board Certified Teacher, right? That's
Or your,
professional credentials.
yes, or your, schedule or something that you need to communicate to your class consistently.
Or-
Some sort of mantra your class might have, I don't know.
Those would not be considered taglines per se. Those would be more in the line of who the teacher is,
Okay.
identifying the
Normally your
person.
signature edition, though.
Yeah.
so I'm just thinking back to Jonathan's definition of government speech versus personal viewpoint. And, I think the mission and vision, making sure that is allowed, or personal credentials, or that sort of information. I don't know if that just ends up going into RNP so it can be better defined if a staff member would like to know more about what's acceptable and what's not, because it could change.
It will change, most likely, yes.
Right.
Personal taglines or signature additions are not permitted on WCPSS emails or other WCPS accounts. Just basically, I mean, it just is, and then the work would be around what is personal, and that there can be some definition fleshed out on that, with the intent that government speech, you're restating the mission of the district, is okay, but when you are actually making your own viewpoints known, then that is not okay. Is
And
that-
again, not okay as a signature.
As a signature.
Or a
Tagline,
tagline.
but you absolutely can have it if it's relevant in your communication.
Everybody comfortable generally?
So I have, just to
Is that
double
okay?
check, Mr. Bloomberg, the use of personal taglines or signature additions are not allowed on WCPSS email or other accounts. Is that,
The use of, you have the word personal in there?
yes, I did.
Yes, that sounds okay if the committee is good with it.
Accounts or communications, whatever
Yeah.
you think.
Okay.
Put personal in there.
And I think we have to explicitly share that information with our staff, because I know, we've all put, whether it's something, a quote from Harry Wong, or, another education-related piece, just making sure that our staff understands and our student understand what that means in a separate communication.
Well, and that gets to there's references to training, so at some point, I
Yes,
think we
we'll
need
get
to
to that
talk,
one in just
we'll
a
get to where the training is. And I want to note that Ms. Monica Johnsonhossler has joined us a while back, so welcome Ms. Johnsonhossler virtually to our committee meeting. So she and Ms. Carter are virtual, and I'm trying to keep an eye on any hands being raised virtually. So,
Before we leave this topic, I just want to, Ms. Gaddis mentioned to you that there is work being done to try to help flesh out what the line before that means in terms of giving guidance to staff on that. So what does sort of that brief personal use by employees, as long as it doesn't interfere, it's some incidental and occasional personal use. So this is not, this is for personal reasons, you're using the system, and what's allowed and what's not allowed. And so if any board member, while we're here, wants to weigh in a little bit on that, I mean, I took it, but I just would be really interested if anybody had any difference on that, that was really more designed as a ministerial communication about what time you're going to be home, and that you need to communicate with family from time to time on it, or what have you. But it really wasn't designed to open the door to large-scale expression.
Correct.
For personal reasons and in political statements and the like, that it was meant to be just more like as a matter of convenience, you're on that, and that we don't want to hold employees back. They got a lot to do if they need to send a quick email home or what have you.
Yeah, because previous policy was there's no personal use of a Wake County school system device, and that was just so hard and fast that, to your point, saying, do you want me to pick milk up on my way home is breaking policy, and that's a little excessive, but we don't.
That was my memory of the discussion.
Right,
That
and
we
I
just
think-
thought
so
that was
I-
unduly restrictive, but it wasn't designed to open the door for political and social
Right.
and cultural viewpoints being. Is that aligned?
And I think this language that's here captures that incidental and occasional personal
Okay.
use is perfect. So
I really appreciate
I
it.
think. Dr. Thank you for bringing that up, Ms.
So
Blumberg.
I completely concur with that vein of the discussion. I think some of it will be clarified a little bit more if we change a little bit the compliance and punishment. So I mean, as we get later in this, there's a lot of punishment language in this document, which I'm not a big fan of. A little bit like we did with the student code of conduct. I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, hey, this is appropriate direction. Specific to this point, I don't see that that administrators are going to be policing your emails to see if you asked to pick up milk or if you made a political statement. But I think this is more, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the tenor of this is more, in the event that there's an issue and we go back to look at it, you have no right to privacy. Frankly, you have no right to privacy to asking for milk to be picked up on the way home, right? So, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, this is more a flag to say, you don't have privacy protection for what you do here, and we're not going to be policing you to see what personal use you did, but if there was personal use and there is an issue, we now can look at it. Is that not kind of the context?
What I would say in response to that is complaints arise. And they arise. Somebody said, look, I just ended up getting copied on this, and I think it's an inappropriate use of the email because the person went on and on with political expression using your resources. It's helpful to be able to say, hey, this has come up. The intent of this personal use was not that.
Right.
It was about the milk. It wasn't about that. And the person said, okay, I get it. And so it does help give some guidance and direction to know that. But I think there's an active screening or any intent to do active screening? To my knowledge, no.
No, there is not.
Right.
You are correct.
Which is where I think we might want to, when we get there, work some of that language into some of the disciplinary side of it, because you could read this right now and think Big Brother is out there trying to monitor you to catch you on something. And I don't think that's our intent at all.
No, not at all.
Ms. Mahaffey.
Well, I'm just thinking, if we have a staff member or a parent that just needs to check their personal email because they're, selling, I don't know, Norwex or something on the side, and happens to do it on this device, is that we're not monitoring that. But if, they're sending it from their Wake County email, I think that's a different story.
Correct.
Right? Okay.
But that does get back to the point that it's not directly in a change here, but there are several points where we have the language that X, Y, or Z, when connected to a school system, tech resources. Right, so that would be, I'm on Lundberg, I happen to check my farmer's market stand. There I'm doing business. Ah, damn it, I didn't get off of Lundberg and get onto another server, right? That's technically in violation.
So that, I just would like to say that came up at the last meeting, and it's just an excellent question for exploration. There is absolutely, I think you would all recognize there's a difference between using your Wake County Public School System email account and blasting out political, cultural, social messages, and being on your own personal device, using your own personal email and sending one message or multiple messages or what have you, and it happens to go through the network here. And so, I don't know if that's today something that can be fully delineated. I think it's a great topic to chew on and come back, because I do think that, if you all want to, you can do it today. I'm not trying, but I do think it's one, that is being identified as different from most of the expression and ideas that are embodied
Yes.
in this.
And-
It's part of the new world of the internet is available.
And bringing up this policy and revising it, these issues are coming up. So
Yeah.
if Ms. Gaddis, if you could speak to two things, the training that's involved, and I know we have one more change, and maybe that gets to the issues of privacy and monitoring. I mean, because the policy says users must respect the privacy of others. So that's a chunk in this policy, but it also says users have no expectation of privacy. And that's to the point that most owners and businesses and other entities monitor their email systems. But what is the monitoring aspect and the training aspect, if you don't mind giving us some summary on that?
Sure, those are big orders.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
so from the.
But I think that's what it's
Sure,
it's
from
a
the
question
monitoring
to everyone.
perspective, and I want to go back to something Dr. Martin mentioned. There is not active monitoring. There is logging of systems. Any technology system is logging what you do. That is your email. That is, if you go to Starbucks knows that you logged in. There are those types of things like how, when you logged in, how you logged in, what IP address you logged in. Those are types of things that are running on systems that we have logs for. Active monitoring is not something we do. It is literally, to Dr. Martin's point earlier, there is an investigation, there is a question, and then we have to go into data to find the answer. That can be directed from an HR perspective, that can be a parent request, that can be a teacher request, it could be an admin request, it could come from a lot of different places. If nothing else, the pandemic has taught us that lots of people have questions about the technology use of students, and so we do try to help our parents understand how students are using technology in this time as well. From a training perspective, we have the internet safety, which we'll get into in the R&P in just a minute. Every school is required to do internet safety training for their students. From a perspective of staff, we do have two pieces of training that we've done up at this point in time for the beginning of year trainings. We do have a CyberSense training, and we do have the, if you'll remember, the phishing training that we had a long conversation about as a group. So both of those are in that. I certainly do see that once we come to a place where this policy is approved, what we have already talked about in our department is providing documentation and videos and training around what this looks like for an elementary student, what it looks like for a middle school student, a high school student, and staff. And so providing better clarity around that from that perspective. So those are things that are coming down the road, but we didn't want to start creating those until we had an approved policy to begin that out with.
Which speaks to the need for us to have this policy approved again. So thank you for bringing
You're
us back to that. Ms. Mahaffey.
So I'm curious, Ms. Kushner, with knowing that the R&P piece is coming up, knowing that we're talking about the policy, do we hold making a motion on this policy before and look at the R&P, and maybe that'll answer some of our questions, or?
Yes, I think that's a good idea. Why don't we look at that?
That'd be fun.
Next, and we can come back to the policy, so it's not, I'm not trying to shut off discussion of the policy, so if you don't mind reviewing that.
All right.
Thank you,
Would
Ms.
you like me to go
Gaddis.
to the last change on
Yes,
the policy?
yes,
All right,
I'm sorry.
perfect.
One more
Last
change.
page, under personal websites. We've had someone point out, a very, very smart person point out to us that we had information about students and volunteers, but not staff. And so to the volunteers' perspective, we have added the staff language as well, meaning staff should not be having inappropriate relationships with our students online. And that's ultimately what that last section is in regards to. And so we've just added the staff language and fixed the grammatical once we added staff to it.
All right, thank you, Ms. Gaddis. So any final questions on that change before we go to the R&Ps, the R&P is going to help us, I think, figure out the policy, so
Yeah,
go
no
on.
question
Thank
that.
you, Ms.
I have one
Gaddis.
other issue to raise.
Okay,
but, yeah.
all right, if you don't mind holding on, and then we'll get to we'll circle back. Thank you, Dr. Martin.
All right, moving to the R&P then. If you look under A, Wake ID, because again, we are collapsing this from a student technology responsible use to a student and staff, we've added and staff member to this under both sections there. Under B, under laptops and devices, we had some large conversations about this the last time, so I want to make sure that you can see here where we've changed some of the language. Parents who do not want their student to be issued a Wake County device may opt to provide their own for the student's use at school, so long as the device is a laptop computer, no tablets, has the latest operating system, includes keyboard, camera, and microphone. I think one of the pieces of feedback you had was just to put it in a narrative, not a list. And the device must otherwise be safe, adequate, and compatible with our educational services and technology resources. And then the rest was struck out of that, that piece.
I did appreciate in the beginning of the school year when there was the opt-out form that came in that, giant packet that you get every year.
Yes, sir.
And it did explicitly say what the district was looking for. And so I really appreciated that being put into action and making it very clear to parents what the expectation was if they wanted to provide a personal device.
Well, and we can thank our parents for that as well, because throughout the pandemic, our parents were very clear to us about what worked and what didn't work at home. And so a lot of the information that was in here was based on parent feedback.
It's good to know. And I think it would, continue to have, I would hope, get that feedback so that we would update every year. It could very well change. Another reason not to put it in policy, because every year it might be, different requirements.
Absolutely. As you know, technology is constantly evolving, so I imagine I'll be seeing you regularly on a lot of these,
Yes.
on a lot of these pieces.
And it speaks to the need to keep things up to date and communicate and train our staff and students.
Correct.
So thank you.
The last change in this section was well brought out. We had some folks give us feedback, and it was really good feedback. It is the second to last sentence where it says, the fact that device is private property does not insulate it from inspection and monitoring. That caused a lot of confusion with our families because their thought was, what's the purpose of me bringing my own if you're still going to search it anyway? And really, the statement should have had added to it pursuant to policy 4342, which is student searches, excuse me. So reasonable suspicion is required before it can be inspected. Before a teacher can take a device or an administrator can take a device, there has to be reasonable suspicion in that.
And I should note 4342 student searches does have notification of parents, guardians in that policy, which was added in our
Yes,
most
and
recent-
devices are
and devices
also
is
in
part
that.
of that. So there will be family, parent notification. Ms. Mahaffey.
Ms. Gaddis, what is the expectation of staff if a student brings their own personal device? I know back when we had BYOD schools, it was, the teacher really couldn't interact necessarily with the device because it was the personal property of the student and their family. Is that expectation still in place, or what is the expectation for our staff when it comes to personal devices from students?
It still is the same way, and when parents had to sign off that they did not want a Wake County device, they had to they sign off understanding that they are the ones to provide any type of technical support. Certainly, if there is an issue with Canvas or Google, a teacher can talk a student through that. But if it's related to the device specifically, that's something that the family has taken responsibility for.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And Ms. Gaddis, as we've talked about, technology continues to evolve, and you're likely to be back before us several times. I was just curious, with your experience over the past year and a half, 2 years, when we say laptop computer, is that clear to parents what that means versus notebook computer or workbook computer or other names that people have ascribed to Chromebooks and similar products? Is it understood, or do you still see any confusion?
No, for the most part, that's understood. The key clarification, there was no tablets. So if it is specifically a tablet, and again, that was parent feedback that a lot of the tablets themselves did not meet specs for them during the pandemic, during remote learning. So any of the types, to your point, a workstation, a desktop, all of those things for the most part, if they're at home, a desktop you can't carry back and forth
Right.
clearly, but
I just meant between of the portable computers. I know that some manufacturers really try to differentiate. This is
Sure.
different than a laptop. This is better than a laptop. But you found that most families still understand that a Chromebook is a laptop, is a notebook computer, is
yes, sir.
all the same. Okay,
Yeah.
great.
So
Thank
far,
you.
we haven't had that confusion.
Perfect, thank you.
But since you said it today, I'll probably have that tomorrow. It's all good.
I just want to say, as an aside, I've only heard rave reviews from students and parents about the laptops that have been issued this year by our technology team. So just taking a moment to say kudos for between the level of Chromebook that's available and what it can do, and having that extra protective piece has been, I've heard nothing but good things.
We appreciate that. Thank you very much. All right, under C, under web-based applications, this actually was part of a staff communication in the past, but just as a reminder that all Wake County business has to be used, done through authorized communication through Wake County channels. If a school is wanting to use something else, it has to be an approved application before they can use it. So if they find this new great app that they want to use, it still has to be approved before they can use it to communicate with families and students. All right, under D, this was also taken from 3013, and so we added here the annual training for internet safety, that our principals have to maintain records related to that, and how the program is being implemented at the school. So that is a principal requirement that they are aware of. It's been that way for quite some time. We just moved this over in policy. And that is it for R&P changes.
No questions, feedback on both 3225, the policy, and R&P for technology responsible use. And I appreciate the fact that staff, volunteers, and students are all being held to the same standards for privacy and other issues. Ms. Scott.
Thank you. And I have to echo Ms. Mahaffey's feedback about our devices. It certainly does make things a whole lot easier for families in monitoring what their kiddos are doing. I just had a quick question on the policy itself under section G2. Is there a clearer definition of what inappropriate online interaction with students? Maybe I feel like that's potentially a little broad. If they don't, they better not. But if one of my children had, a social media account, would I want them to be friends with, a teacher? I feel like that's not a great thing, but but that's my personal feelings. However, another parent may feel differently about that. So I'm just, is there a place where that's more clearly defined? Because I feel like that's, what does inappropriate online interaction with students mean? Does that mean anything outside of this is to do with education, period? Joking? I mean, what is that? Is there a clearer way to understand that?
Yes, ma'am. We have policy 4040, which is in our new policy manual called Staff-Student Relations, and it outlines romantic relationships and sexual contact prohibited. There are restrictions on electronic communications there and reporting inappropriate conduct. So those things are laid out.
Okay, thank you. I
in
appreciate that.
Policy 4040, Staff-Student Relations.
Okay.
So is this a case where linking to that policy so that there could be more clarity would be acceptable?
Let's take a look at 4040 just to make sure that it's broad enough if we could. Because I mean,
And thank you, Dr. Crane. I was fairly certain we had something, but I couldn't remember exactly where it was.
I think
And
it
what
looked-
was that
I think it
number
looked
again?
Very, very specific and very good. I think it would be a good policy to reference.
Thank you.
It's very detailed about what would be permissible and not. It's a great question to raise. Appropriate can be a little bit vague. So that would be a good opportunity for a cross-reference.
We'll be glad to add that.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
That was part of your earlier elaboration.
Yes, yes. And I thought the expectation was that we would keep communication within the school system between students and teachers within our school system communication systems. And I don't know if this is a question for Mr. Blumberg, but would do the records through technology and use constitute a student record? And are they treated with the same level of confidentiality? And do you think that maybe the privacy issues outlined in this policy are all that should govern use of technology, and it just is contained in this policy? Because looking at student records, it does not seem that emails are student records, because it includes other forms that are subject to FERPA.
They could be, but are not necessarily.
If you're asking whether every single stitch of electronic communication that touches a student is a record of that student, the answer is no.
Okay.
I mean, it relates to the student and it's maintained, pertaining to that student, that would be the student ref, or a mere reference to a student alone, I don't think would automatically make it a student record. If you're talking about maintaining records of training, if that's what you're referring to, or a record of a student, having been trained on it, or something a student would sign to show that they have signed off on and understand the policy, yes, those would all be, related to the student specifically,
Okay.
maintained about that student, and that would be a student record. If somebody said, hey, I want to know whether, Susie had been trained, that child said something inappropriate to my kid, the record of Susie in training would be a confidential student record.
Okay.
So,
Thank you. That adds clarity. Dr. Martin?
Yeah, so the issue I wanted to raise yet is somewhat related to that, the privacy discussion that we've had. And this is where I've heard the most concern from people in the community. When the privacy statements, I think, are there for a reason, because there are times where we need to look in to see what's going on, particularly for monitoring safety, looking out for bullying and those kinds of things. But if you just read the language cold, it feels a little big brother-ish. Is somebody actively looking? And no, we're not. We don't have the personnel capacity to do that.
No, sir, we do not.
But I wonder if there might be some wisdom to adding a statement that says that. I mean, there are elements of it that are sort of in there a little bit, and we catch a little bit of it in the student use G1, I think. But might we make some kind of a statement on the order of that the system will not engage in active searches, and even add particularly with the intent to profile a student with respect to race, gender identity, political affiliation, religious affiliation, the standard list of things. Because I think from some of the comments I have heard, that is where some of the fear is, that this could be a way to out a student that maybe is not out or is engaged in some religious or political affiliation that is different than what somebody else would like. And so there's a difference between, bullying, fights, that kind of surveillance, but we don't want to get into any kind of profiling. I don't think we do that. I know we don't do that, actually, but it just strikes me that if we would be maybe a little bit more intentional, stating that, hey, it is not appropriate to profile for any of these kinds of reasons, would that frame the privacy language in a little bit better context based on some of what we have heard from some people reading it where it seems just a little too onerous.
Well, and I would add an overall framework that this technology responsible use policy is all about protecting students and keeping students safe as they use technology.
Yes.
Not to criminalize students, not to out students, not to, persecute them for anything, or criminalize
Right.
knucklehead behavior. We are working to have safety in our use of technology. So is there can be some language as an overall framework? Ms. Scott, you're going to...
I was just thinking ahead of as to how our transportation policies are phrased. It's that same way, this exists for the safety
Right.
of children. So if there were a statement, in order to best protect all students, I mean, I'm not great at writing the things like some of you are, but in order to, protect the safety of all students when engaging in technology, internet, et cetera.
That's our intent, absolutely. The intent of staff, the intent of our faculty and our staff, that they want to protect kids. And we've gotten a lot of feedback and concern from parents about this, because it opens up, we have the language. It gives students interaction with our larger global community. There's a lot out there, and we want to make sure that they're using it responsibly and are safe when they're at school.
Well, and the safety is exactly why we have a privacy section. But if we lead with the statement of safety and what we're committed to, instead of, right now it leads with students, employees, and visitors and other users have no expectation of privacy. Woof, right there you get hit. And that does not communicate the intent to me that the purpose is safety. So it just feels like if this led with that protective safety, no profiling.
This B9 says users must respect the privacy of others and references FERPA and
Exactly.
that. So I don't know if we've stalled enough for the great minds before us to
There's
come up
also a
with one.
statement at the very beginning of the
Yeah, that's where I was
policy
going.
Yes.
that drives this, and whether it bears repeating or modifying in some way in the privacy section, because what it says is, let me see if I can get it.
The board
The
intends.
board intends, yeah, that students and employees benefit from these resources while remaining within the bounds of safe, legal, and responsible use. So if that's a header at the top of the policy, you're saying a version of that repeated in the section on privacy in particular.
And referencing anti-discrimination language that we have in other
Yeah.
policies.
I mean, that's sort of where
That's an
my brain was
additional
going,
piece.
is to be explicit about this should not be used for discriminatory purposes.
If I could make a couple of points. One, the model policy from the School Boards Association, actually, where it talks about potential monitoring, what it actually says that the school system shall. So if you look at E, first paragraph, where it says school system personnel may monitor online activities of individuals who access, and again, we're only talking about the school system information technology here. The district and the board changed that to may.
Correct.
So to say, no, that is not an expectation that staff shall be doing it. So, I mean, you have already sort of staked out where you all stand on it versus what would be the model policy from the School Boards Association. The other thing that could be done where where you have school system, may do that, you could say subject to the requirements set forth in Board Policy 1710, which is your anti-discrimination policy, which I think would make it clear that you would not be then doing any searches for discriminatory reasons. I do worry a little bit, Dr. Martin, about adding language about no active, because I just think that any time that information is uncovered, somebody would push back and say, oh, that was an active search and you violated your policy. But if you included the language that it would be subject to Board Policy 1710, that I think that gets the message that you can't go about doing the profiling, we're out to get language. And so I think that would cover you on that, and I think your superintendent has made a good suggestion about bringing into this section as well the language. And it's okay to repeat good language if you're wanting to make that point about the purpose of the policy. The last thing I'd like to say on this is that while that language, and I agree that language does hit you sort of cold about no expectation of privacy, it is also, it is beneficial notice to people that they're on notice. That, you know, when you're using this, you'd kind of like to know, hey, is this private, or is somebody going to be able to look at this? And we want people to know they don't have an expectation of privacy when they're using our information technology, because it's copied, it's recorded, and it is subject to inspection as needed. And so there is importance and fairness to the public and everybody in knowing that. But I agree, the softening and the reiterating of the earlier language, as well as the anti-discrimination language, I think will capture a lot of what
Thank you.
the good points the board's made.
Well, and I completely concur that it can be bold and up there.
Yeah.
It's just bringing it with the why sets it in a different if it's just up there, then it's just like, it's much more jolting. But if it's there to be clear, but it's associated with the why, then all of a sudden, okay, now I get it.
So, Dr. Martin, just to make sure, and board, I would start section E with the board intends that students and employees benefit from these resources while remaining within the bounds of safe, legal, and responsible use, subject to board 1710, and then I
No,
would.
the subject to, I think, would go to me near, it's fine. I think that would be under the last sentence in that, where it says school system personnel
Okay.
may monitor, who acts, we're talking about the monitoring then, saying
Okay.
subject to.
Gotcha, okay,
Yeah.
perfect.
Thank
But
you.
everything else you said, I think
Just-
was aligned.
Yes.
And
Just
what was
wanted
the
to-
other policy that we were going to reference?
1710.
No, the other one.
4040.
4040. Okay.
Yeah,
Just want to make sure we,
and that's it in 2 under G.
okay.
Well, and with the link to 1710, give the name so that people
Yes.
know that
Yes.
this is the
Yes.
discriminatory intent.
Be glad to do that.
Prohibitions on harassment, discrimination, bullying, yeah.
Again, I like redundancy in some cases, and I think particularly with this policy, there's a need for clarity and expectations, so. And we've gotten a lot of community feedback, so I think it's appropriate for us to be specific.
So when
Dr.
you guys
Crane,
go-
are you getting all of this for us? Thank you, ma'am.
So when you go past robust conversation, we need to come up with the adjective for that.
Well, that's where, isn't this where we send the bill to the School Boards Association for improving the policies?
Robust on steroids.
Right, right. So, thank you. Thank you all for that feedback. Any other additions? Any other feedback? And again, we could keep talking about this because it is such an evolving part of what we do, but at the same time, we need to finalize some policy for Ms. Gaddis to be able to do the training and get the expectations clarified to what we've talked about. So, any further comments or feedback? We will be bringing this forward for first reading, so if I could get a motion from committee members to move this to action.
Motion to bring it to action with the changes recommended by the board this afternoon.
Thank you, that Dr. Crane is so expertly captured. Thank you, ma'am. There's a motion, is there a second?
Second.
Second from Ms. Mahaffey. Any further discussion? Ms. Johnsonhossler, Ms. Carter, any parting thoughts? We appreciate you. Ms. Johnsonhossler?
None for me, Ms. Kushner. Thank you for asking.
All right, thanks. Thank you both, and thanks for the robust discussion that we've had, Mr. Blumberg. So with no further ado, we have a motion and a second to move this to our next board meeting. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much for the continued work and the months-long work to make this really strong policy in R&P. Thank you, Ms. Gaddis, for
Thank
all
you
you're
all.
doing for our kiddos out there. Appreciate it. All right, and as I mentioned, we're going to bring the parking for students and visitors to our December 8th meeting, given the feedback. And I was telling someone that parking is really important to a lot of people, so we will make sure we get that right. So now we have Mr. Schneidmiller and Mr. Strickland. Thank you for being here today for a suite of transportation policies. As I mentioned, Wake County had specific policies that now we're working to align with the School Board Association. So Dr. Crane has worked with Mr. Schneidmiller and staff so that we parse it out in different chunks that will align it more closely with the School Board Association. So welcome, Mr. Schneidmiller and Mr. Strickland. We'll go ahead and start with bus fleet management. Good afternoon. If you could turn on your, so we can,
Let's try that again. Good
all
afternoon.
right, good afternoon.
Today, we're bringing you, as you said, a batch of transportation policies. These policies are all a part of the policy migration process. We're bringing these in batches because no one single policy replaces a single current policy, and instead, each new policy replaces multiple parts of multiple current policies.
So just for something to look forward to, after this group, we have like 2 more groups of transportation policies. So again, underscoring the important service that public schools provide to kids to get them to school on public transportation and
I
on
know you just
yellow
can't get
buses.
enough of it, right?
It is, pardon?
You just can't get enough of it.
No, I
right?
know.
Okay.
We just, so thank you.
All right. So the first new policy, 6307, bus fleet management, is a WCPSS only policy. The current policy is numbered 7150. When you review the current policy, we did not include section C2, operator responsibility. That section will appear in new 6315 driver's policy. In the first paragraph of section B, we added a sentence regarding the titling of buses. We'd like to strike that sentence as it appears in section D1, letter A of this policy. We would like to edit section D1, letter A, to say all buses and transportation service trucks. The remainder of the system-owned vehicles will be covered by another policy that you will see in the future.
So, Mr. Steinman, you're saying both that first sentence in B and in D1A, all buses and transportation service trucks? Is that what you'd said?
Yes.
So instead of other system-owned vehicle?
That's correct.
Okay.
In lieu of other system-owned vehicles, we will say transportation service trucks.
Transportation service
Right.
trucks.
As this pertains to bus fleet management, this policy.
And what's a transportation service truck?
It would be, we have 3 different types. We have the service truck, the yellow service trucks that go out with our field mechanics. We have a fuel truck
Okay.
that goes out and fills buses, and we have tow trucks.
So vehicles that are supporting our bus fleet.
Correct, and they are all yellow. by the
All
way.
right,
Okay.
good. Easy to spot. Okay.
All righty.
So those are the 2 main changes to 6307, working with School Board Association policy and Wake County policy.
Yeah.
For
And
this
so
bit.
we
Yes.
would also, if I could, like
Yes.
to edit the last sentence of section B in the first paragraph to say buses will be acquired via state contract, and we would add or appropriate purchasing methods as approved by the WCPSS Purchasing Department utilizing state specifications. This allows us to go outside of state contract and maybe put buses, activity buses out to bid and procure them at a better price. So we look at, state contract prices. When we feel we can do better, we'll put that out to bid and see what we can do. But we can always revert back to the state contract price.
So a way to save taxpayer funds.
Yes,
We're
ma'am.
all for that, sir.
Okay.
Okay.
And so that's the last change of that. So if we can open it up to any questions
Okay,
about
thank you.
policy.
And again, that changes in B, second paragraph. Got it.
The first paragraph.
Thank you.
Section B.
So any discussion from board members? All right. I'll entertain a motion to move this to the full board for approval on first reading.
So moved.
There's a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. So we're, bus fleet management, 6307, will move to full board for final approval. Thank you.
Thank you.
On first reading. Thank you. Next is 6315, drivers, and it's R&P.
Yes, new policy 6315 drivers replaces part of current policies 7130 student safety and conduct while on student transportation, and 7150 bus fleet management. 6315 is an NC School Boards Association policy. Their model policy language is in black. Our existing policy language from current policies 7130 and 7150 has been inserted in burgundy. We included several additional revisions to this policy as seen in numbers 3 and 6. We'd like to make 3 further revisions to the policy. The first would be in section A, number 3. We'd like for it to read, obey all applicable traffic laws and transportation department procedures, duties, and directives.
Okay. Any concerns about adding that language? I'm sorry, Mr. Bell, did you want to chime in, sir?
No, I'm sorry, that was a mistake. A little later in the policy, I do have a comment.
Okay, thank you, sir. We'll come back then.
In section B, we'd like to add a new number 1, which would be that it would be approved and cleared by risk management. And I think this is where Mr. Bell may want to
Okay.
chime in.
And that would be number 1, not 4.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
his suggestion was to make that number 1 under section B.
Okay.
And the specific language is implying that the driver must be approved. What is the approval process? That's,
This is a perfect time for Mr. Bell to weigh in. He has a specific process for this. Cecil, you weigh in here?
Yes, Julie, thank you. Dr. Martin, you're correct. It is for the approval of the driver process. It is not for yellow bus drivers. However, the policy refers to yellow bus drivers and activity bus drivers. It also refers to volunteer drivers. Our school fleet and our activity buses, and there are occasions when there may be a couple of yellow service vehicles that are insured under our auto policy that we purchase through risk management. They're not covered by tort like yellow buses are. So our insurance company has some requirements of our drivers that they must meet before they can be cleared and added to our policy as a driver. The way we do that, the driver must be a WCPS employee, meaning that they must have an Oracle ID. We do have some volunteer positions such as coaches that don't receive a stipend. However, they are in Oracle, and that way we're able to run them through as unpaid staff for insurance purposes. But they have to submit their information to risk management. Risk management then submits that information to our insurance carrier. Our carrier runs a check. If there are any questions they have, we clear up those questions with the applicant. After they're clear, we send them an email that lets them know that they are approved to drive one of our white fleet vehicles or our activity buses if they meet all the qualifications.
thank you. I understand and support the idea. The challenge I had is the language seemed a little bit nebulous, that must be approved by risk management, right? If you have to get the commercial driver's license, you can go online and you can see these are the things I have to do to get my commercial driver's license. So my only question here, and I fully understand why it's there, is if I'm looking to get this, how do I know what this risk management approval is? I mean, there are people who are, very concerned about, will this, that, or the other thing be disclosed? And it feels a little bit too nebulous to just say approved by risk management. And I wonder if we, is there some formal protocol like the commercial licensing requirements? Is there, some insurance protocol? I'm looking for some standardization so that if I'm interested in applying, I know what it is that I have to do. And again, it gets at our non-discriminatory intent that I don't like you, so I'm not going to prove you through risk management, if that makes sense.
So, I mean, obviously, we don't do that, but I do think that, number one, the risk management review might not be the same for everyone and might be driven by, might be some standard things to begin with, and then driven by what the answers to some things might be. So I don't know if there may be in the driver application process or the review process, there is an acknowledgement that risk management conducts a review and maybe some bullets around those things, but I don't know that it will be the same for every single person. But I do understand where you're coming from in terms of just understanding, and I don't know if there's any additional guidance around that, because I think it changes. It's going to be different, and what risk management reviews might change over the years as well.
Sure.
So
Would it help to at least to list the purpose behind that? So it's not like we're just screening, it's for the purpose of acquiring insurance, or for the purpose for insurance purposes. If we just said, approval by risk management for insurance purposes, that at least is, anybody reading that understands, yeah, that makes sense because of the district. So if we just added for insurance purposes, would that help?
That would help me?
Okay.
And I would still like it to be fourth instead of first, because it seems odd to me to put that first. I don't know why. Just because I think having a required license seems the primary need. And I should note that Board Member Roxy Cash has also joined us, so welcome, Ms. Cash. Sorry for the late acknowledgement, but we're glad you're virtually with us.
But to your point, Ms. Kushner, that would logically follow, if you have to carry insurance for your vehicle, then you need to pass risk management for the purposes of Wake County insurance.
I like Mr. Blumberg's delineation and having it as the fourth bullet, so it builds on the logic. Thank you. If that's okay with the committee and board members. Were y'all able to capture all that? Thank you, thank you. And then you had another addition or
Yes.
change, Mr. Sinai Miller?
Yes, ma'am. Finally, we recommend striking the second to last paragraph regarding private automobile liability coverage. We don't encourage the use of private cars to transport students. In fact, we actively discourage it, and for that reason, we wish to strike this from the policy.
All right. So striking that whole last paragraph in B. Do we have vehicles that social workers and other staff can use to help students when there is an issue that they need to transport or support students or families to get additional resources? Or is it something we simply do not encourage, even in a...
Yeah, I don't believe we have a fleet of vehicles, and Mr. Bell may know better, but I'm not aware of a fleet of vehicles or pool vehicles that staff can use for that purpose.
So it's just, we might be supporting students in other ways, but not in providing transportation
Yes.
in a vehicle for a student other than a bus transportation that is required for getting to and from school.
Yes, primarily school bus
Okay.
or contract.
Or games. Ms. Scott?
And I completely understand why, but as I think of some of the more remote parts of our district and knowing full well that sometimes that just happens, or a bus doesn't come and somebody, the AP goes and picks up the kids that are there. I mean, this does happen, and I know it shouldn't, but it gives me pause to not have something else in place for those rare but necessary circumstances.
Well, I guess this paragraph refers to if the board requires a social worker to use their private,
Not to use it, it's
To
if
use
you're
it.
requiring them to increase.
Increase it. I gotcha.
Their liability insurance
Okay.
in order to transport a child. And what I
Okay.
think staff is saying is that the district isn't requiring anybody to transport somebody on a private vehicle, much less asking them to increase their liability insurance. So it doesn't have any application in Wake.
That makes perfect sense. Thank
Okay.
you for that clarification.
Thank you, Ms. Scott, for raising what should, it does happen, but also doesn't need to be outlawed in policy. So thank you. Thank you, Ms. Scott. Any other feedback or changes? Mr. Simon, do you have any other changes? Would you like to look at the RNP?
Yes, ma'am.
Before we, let's look at the RNP before we go to approving the policy as a committee. Thank you.
Okay, new 6315 RMP drivers replaces current policy 7110 RMP, transportation responsibilities. We revised the old list of driver qualifications to those we currently use. We are still in the process of revising this RMP with input from Mr. Bloomberg and Mr. Ramey to make certain that we feel comfortable that these qualifications are updated and they need to be, or they're where we need them to be to qualify our bus drivers. So we'll continue that work and finish that process.
Thank you, Mr. Schneidmiller. Any questions from committee members? Dr. Martin?
Yeah, so two questions. One is on point A4, which is also in the RNP to 6305. Just curious about the statement that says that you can't use a mobile phone or related technology while the bus is in motion. A lot of people use cell phones for GPS. That may not, even if it's not your mobile phone, it strikes me that is related technology. I think the intent of this is no talking on the cell phone, probably even hands-free if you're operating the bus, but the language strikes me as not what we intend. And so I don't have the magic language to take it where we intend, but I'm just concerned that this becomes confusing. Because I think the intent is conversations, even hands-free,
Yeah.
while using mobile technology.
Yeah, the intent is no distractions, period.
Right.
And certainly, nothing where you're holding a phone in your hand and, that, infringes on your ability to drive the school bus, infringes on that.
Right,
So,
but I mean, we have independent GPSs. Do drivers ever need to use their cell phones as a GPS?
Yeah, so
What about
bus
on
drivers do
activity
not,
buses?
bus drivers do not use GPS while they're on a school bus. If anything, they'll have a hard copy of run directions, stop by stop. We don't have anything like we have as a GPS unit in our car that tells us directional mapping. And so there's no reason for them, that we see that as a distraction just as well as a phone, where they're looking down, looking at a GPS unit, trying to pay attention to that. We train our bus drivers to know their route. If they're a substitute, they get run directions so that they know how to run the route and which stops to make, and we keep it at that.
Mr. Blumberg wants to chime in.
The only thing I would just wanted to add to it is that the language really comes right out of criminal statute. So I just would, this would be one where I would sort of want to weigh in favor of keeping the language, because it is a misdemeanor to violate it, and it basically says what the offense is, and it's using a mobile phone or any additional technology associated with the mobile phone while the bus is in motion. And so that's what.
We're still on driver's
It's
policy.
in
Sorry,
drivers,
it's
though,
A4.
that statement is also in the RNP of 6305. So there's a number of things in 6315 and 6305 that are actually pretty confusing as to which should be where. So I don't know even, and that was going to be a later question after we talked about these two, is I do wonder if these two policies don't need a little bit of additional looking at, because there are a number of things in 6305, which is about safety, which are also talking about drivers. So I accept your legal language. I think the not having GPS on a bus, I personally would have some concern about, because I think that can alert to traffic and a number of things, but that's, I guess, a different discussion at this point. So I'll accept that that's the legal language and we need to go for it.
And again, we're
So-
trying to align with the School Board Association, so when there is statutory changes, we can
Right.
update it. So I think that's why they're divided where they are, just trying to, and looking at the migration, make sure that we're able to update it, because this migration is taking us, I mean, we're trying to make it easier in the long run
Right.
by
So my-
going through this work in the short term, which has
My-
become the long run.
My other question about the driver's policy is,
And again, Dr. Martin was talking about A4, just for y'all following at home.
right. My bigger question for this policy, what's not here, is we've recently and periodically throughout my time on the board, received complaints about aggressive bus drivers, sometimes aggressive with respect to students, sometimes aggressive driving strategies, and so on. And I didn't really see anything in here that has driver expectations in terms of relationships with students, in terms of, customer service, welcoming, being, just creating an appropriate atmosphere, or, I mean, we want reasonable judgment in the operation of buses, but like I say, because we have received some emails of late regarding sort of that harsh activity, both physically driving and interacting with students, I was curious if we should have any expectation of that in the policy.
Dr. Martin, if I want to just double check my recollection, didn't we in our previous policy meeting adopt a policy at the beginning in terms of organization of student services that addressed
I mean, student
those
transportation.
student transportation
Yes.
services?
Yes, you're correct. There is a statement to that effect.
That sets those expectations.
There.
So are you looking more for a revision of those expectations or for incorporation or reference back here in this document?
Because that did talk about respect. I remember there was a discussion around the language change about being respectful to
Right,
students.
was it just
or
to
something.
staff or
Yeah.
students, or was it beyond that? I think it was 7110.
I'll try to look it up.
No, appropriate. I didn't, you're right. I hadn't really thought about that when I was reviewing these last night.
Do you think that would address what you needed, or do you want to bring it up as a?
That was the goals policy for 6,300 goals of student transportation services. The
Okay.
very first one we did included that language and was approved on first reading.
Okay.
And we,
last week.
remember we talked about courteous service, working effectively with schools, parents, guardians, private contractors. So I think,
Oh, here it is.
and that'll be before this one, so hopefully it'll, I mean, again, there's a big grouping. Thank you, Mr. Hegarty. Ms. Scott.
Yeah, there were 8 principles or 8 goals that were set. And
Yeah.
I think this would, is it providing courteous service to students and responding promptly and courteously to requests by parents, guardians, and staff? It wasn't at the previous meeting, I misspoke, it was like 2 meetings ago.
Yeah, no, now that you, yeah, I had not reflected on that. That's probably okay.
Okay.
It just felt like we're looking at the expectations of bus drivers, and I didn't see that, and we had these recent emails, and it's just sort of a flag that it was somewhat missing.
Yeah, again, if Wake County was running the policy, we'd do, like we do student code of conduct as a big
Yeah.
outline that you can give to someone, and that's our expectations. And if we had one big transportation policy, we can say, here it is, and, but we're breaking it up, I'm afraid, sorry.
Yeah, no,
So-
fair enough.
But hopefully, we can pull it together as a manual, and we give our parents, maybe we can think about that. But thank you. So
Yeah.
we're circling back. So still on the policy, before we get to the RNP, I would like to move to the RNP before we approve 6315 to move that to the full board. But I think Mr. Schneidermiller went over that they're changing the qualifications and the time phases of certain issues with hiring bus drivers and bus driver qualifications.
Yeah, the RFP reflects the current practice of the
Thank you. Oh, thank you for that. So these recommendations and for changes reflects practice. That's important to get in policy. Thank you. Any questions about bus driver qualifications, the RNP for 6315? I think it's important to get what we're actually doing put in our policies. So with that, returning, so that's, the RNP is for information. So unless there's further discussion, if I could hear a motion on the new policy changes to drivers 6315.
Make a motion to have policy 6315 move to action of the board for first reading.
Right.
With the changes discussed.
Thank you. Which I think Dr. Crane and Mr. Steinmiller have captured. So there's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Second from Mr. Haggerty. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. So we will move drivers, the new policy driver 6315 to the full board for approval on first reading. All right, Mr. Steinmiller, your next one is safety and student transportation services, both the policy migration revisions and RNP for information.
Okay, thank you. New policy 6305 replaces...
If you could speak up just a wee bit.
All right,
I'd
sorry.
appreciate it, sir. Thank you.
New policy 6305 replaces the remainder of the current policy 7130. Again, you will see the NC Board Association model policy language in black. Language that was added from our current policies is included in red or burgundy font. Last, any additions or revisions were made to either of those can be found in blue font. Some of that added language is first seen in the first paragraph. The second paragraph is different. The NC Board Association began including a blanket COVID-19 statement to the fronts of many policies in 2020. We have not made any practice to include temporary language in our policies, and we recommend striking that language here. Under Section A, we struck the phrase "at the bus stop." At the guidance of Attorney Neil Ramey, his rationale was Policy 4309, Student Code of Conduct, doesn't say, and probably shouldn't, that the Code of Conduct applies at school bus stops at all times. There are a couple of Code of Conduct rules that specifically reference certain types of misconduct at bus stops, but the fact that something occurs on a public street where school buses sometimes pick up students doesn't automatically confer disciplinary jurisdiction. And again, these are Mr. Ramey's words.
Yeah.
School bus stops are not school property in that sense. And then if we go on to Section D, we added the phrases "or transportation supervisor," and that's to reflect current practice. And that's transportation supervisor or designee. And that, again, reflects current practice. Finally, we struck number 3 in Section E because we give schools a tool to share with students about expectations, but don't know in all cases what exactly is communicated to parents. I will say that we've worked over the years with our assistant principal committee in developing tools for school administrators to use and teachers to use in training students on bus safety, as well as, tools to be able to use in communication with parents. So that's an ongoing practice, and we meet with them once a month to make sure that we're helping them in any way we can. So.
All right, so you see the revisions. I'd welcome discussion. Ms. Scott and Ms. Mahaffey.
So I just want to make sure I understand that we're striking number 3 because it's not clear or we don't have the practice of communicating student expectations to students and parents. Is that right?
The practice is to leave it at the school level, And so we build tools with the assistant principals, and then they draw from those tools however they see fit to communicate with their parents, but it's not consistent across the district.
Yeah, that
Should it be?
troubles me.
Yeah, I agree. I highlighted with the question mark because I think we, and as we've said as a board, we are working to have statements of student expectations. And given the feedback we often get from families and students, I would like to keep that statement in and would welcome discussion on that and I think parents need to also be informed of our expectations. I mean, we have laid it out in 6,300 as a minimum, and I think as part of being on our school transportation, they need to meet, students need to know what's expected and respect and courtesy, and parents need to know that as well. So I would welcome discussion.
Just to be clear, the board certainly has the prerogative of saying to the superintendent, I expect that be communicated through
Yeah.
policy. That's what you do. So
And
that's your call.
consistently, there are, there's some things that, and Superintendent Moore, you have good words for this, some is firm and some is wobbly. What's the, you always use it, there's a phrase you use, and it's escaping me, but I think tight and loose. I think this needs to be something tight across our buses.
I think there are expectations that we have where it's appropriate that the school be the one to address it. But when you're on a Wake County bus, you're on a district-provided transportation. And I think, Superintendent Moore, it would be appropriate for that expectation to come from the district. Because whether your bus is out of the Holly Springs district or the East Wake district, it's still our Wake County bus, and the expectations should be the same and clearly communicated, whether a family moves or changes schools. And I think consistent communication, even if it is shared by the school in addition to coming from the district, I think is something that we can make happen.
Well,
Thank
let's
you.
also recognize that particularly on magnet buses sometimes serve more than one school.
And Ms. Scott, did you?
I did.
want to
I just
add?
had one other comment, and I was just a little concerned about the striking the under A, student behavior, striking at the bus stop. I completely understand that came from the advice of Attorney Ramey, but that I'd love at some point, and my apologies if we already had that discussion. And it's been a long year and a half.
No, it hasn't.
No, I share those concerns and want to address that as well.
So I hope we can address that, because, I mean, if I send my child, if they leave my house and they're walking their 0.4 miles to the bus stop, and they get there at that designated bus stop, I'd like to think that another kid can't just.
Well, in the Student Code of Conduct, school transportation disturbance, which is 2.5, level 2.5, disturbances on school buses or other transportation vehicles or near streets at school bus stops can put many students at risk. Any physical or verbal disturbance which occurs at a school, on school transportation vehicle or at a bus stop, and which interrupts or interferes with the safe and orderly operation of the vehicle or otherwise puts others at risk, is prohibited. And I've served on discipline appeals where incidents happened at school bus stops. So I also would like that language included and not eliminated. And I understand Mr. Nate Ramey is recommending, but I think we
No, I understand that.
need to be clear.
So the recommendation was as provided in 4039 student behavior, which would allow it to be at a bus stop when it's being used for the purposes of being there to when the bus is arriving and there is a disturbance or misconduct at that point that would have a direct immediate impact on student discipline. So eliminating it is not to say that you could never discipline a student at a bus stop. It's to say, as provided in 4309 on student behavior and the code of conduct, which does allow it when it has a direct and immediate impact, and when you're using it for the purposes of a bus stop. It just so happens that if a kid is out in the community at a, not at a time when you're being retrieved for the bus, and that is not always deemed school property, and if something happens over the weekend on that spot, or it's not during a time that it's being used for purposes of transportation, that it's not suddenly automatically within our jurisdiction. But the way it is written with the strikeout would still permit you to discipline students at bus stops, when they're engaged in conduct that has a direct impact on the school district, on orderly bus stops, and causes a disruption. It is not a huge issue if you all want to put that back in, and make it with the understanding that what you meant by that is when you're there waiting for the bus, when everybody else is there, and you get into a fight with somebody, we can address that.
Dr. Martin and
So-
Ms. Mahaffey.
I think, because I share the same concern, I hear Dr. Ramey's point, but I think this gets back to, the statement as it reads implies the entirety of the code of conduct applies here, where the code of conduct is fairly specific. And the school bus stop here is raised in a punitive sense, punish if violation. What if we added, right, let's start with a positive statement, right? A safe and orderly environment is created whenever transporting students or while waiting at a bus stop, right? That's our statement, right? That's our expectation. And I think if we put bus stop right there, that would first set the tone on the code of conduct policies apply on school transportation. The school code, aren't we really trying to say the school code of conduct addresses behavior, disciplinary measures, et cetera, on transportation or at the bus stop, right? So I think this statement is maybe trying to be a little too broad to say that the entirety of the code of conduct applies under this scenario, when I think our intent here is to point that the school code of conduct addresses expected behavior and disciplinary consequences for actions at bus stops or in. Does that make sense where I'm going with the wording?
It does, and one of the things Neil also included was you don't have to say anything about bus stops here to make the code of student conduct applicable to some extent at bus stops. We already have a flexible applicability of code section that recites the statutory standard for when off-campus conduct can be disciplined. Again, there are a couple code of conduct rules that specifically apply to bus stops. But that was his take. We have Jonathan here. Clearly, Jonathan has said if you want to leave it in, and I was reading the body language, and the body language definitely said you wanted to leave it in,
Yeah.
with kind of raised eyebrows and a stern look. So I think we can leave it in, and it has the additional qualifier clause there that says the school bus or at the bus stop as provided in policy 4309.
Agreed.
So you have that qualifier there already, that not all of it is applicable there, but
Right.
as covered in 4309, these things are.
And Ms. Carter has her hand up, and then I see Mr. Hegarty and Ms. Mahaffey. Ms. Carter, if you want to chime in.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I was just trying to, that was my concern as well, so I appreciate Ms. Scott bringing that up and Dr. Martin, because I would like to leave that in there.
Thank you, Ms. Carter. Sorry if I saw your hand delayed.
No problem.
Thank you, ma'am. All right, Mr. Hegarty, Ms. Mahaffey.
So I had a whole long thing prepared about statutory construction and like when you intentionally take something out, but I don't want to talk past the sale. If we're all in agreement to leave it in, let's just leave it in and move
All
on.
right. Maybe we take out that comma so it's clear that it's, yeah. So. Ms. Mahaffey, yes.
I agree with Mr. Haggerty. I do want to ask, I know we have a definition of when, the corner of First and Main is a bus stop, right? When is a bus stop clearly defined as a bus stop? And I'm wondering, do we need to share that language here, or is it addressed in a policy later on? I mean, I believe it's 30 minutes before and after the bus arrives.
Yeah, we'll be bringing a policy forward that talks more specifically about bus stops and bus stop design.
Okay. So then maybe we can reference what a bus stop is just by referencing the forthcoming policy as a technical correction.
Again, we got a lot of transportation policies to come, so please, we will be intentional, yes.
I did have more questions if we're
Yes.
ready to move
Yes,
from.
please do.
But I didn't want to
Sure.
stop. I was curious in this policy of 6305, and perhaps this would be covered under the bus stop, the forthcoming bus stop policy as well, is the parent expectations. So we have student behavior, transportation. I know parents are expected to be at the bus stop with students who are in kindergarten through second grade, or perhaps that would also include our pre-K students as well. Is that going to be in that forthcoming policy, or is this a place to put it, or parent, relations with parents? Because that customer service piece is a huge part of our driver's responsibility.
I can say that we currently cover that in the policy around bus stops and bus stop locations, and I think it's a good fit. Personally, I think it's a good fit there. When we talk about the rules of, this is how we place bus stops, these are the expectations of how we retrieve and let students off a bus, all that sort of thing.
And that makes perfect sense to me. I just didn't know I assumed something like that might be coming, but I wanted to ask if this was, the appropriate place. And then in the RNP, we're going to see the lost child piece. And I'm having children in this county that ride the bus. I guess I knew right in my head that there was a procedure, but when you're in that panic of where are my kids, or you're watching, the bus dot, or perhaps the dot doesn't show up on Here Comes the Bus, is there either a link to the information for that number for parents to call? I understand why it's an RMP, because those phone numbers do change, and if they change, you don't have to bring it to the board, but a way to link to a website, or a way that families can access that, because if they're in that panic mode, wondering where their kid is, trying to just bring something up so they're not having to look in multiple places.
And I think it underscores the need to have clear expectations, both for students and that parents know that they have right there. But I'm going to let you answer Ms. Mahaffey's question.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no, I think that does build on the communication that we put together for parents and expectations, and we include language about lost child and the procedures on how to report that. And I think that would be helpful. It is available on our website, and I don't know that all families are familiar with our website, but it seems like they are.
I mean, I've been on it several times, and
Yeah.
I think for me, this is the first time, like I said, I assumed I would call the school, but what happens if no one's at the school? And so I'm seeing this in the RNP, and I'm going, well, of course, that makes sense. But again, when you're in that panic of, oh my goodness, where's my kid?
Yeah.
It's, we're not always, our Google skills are not always the best.
Yeah, and I think another board member expressed a concern. So turning to the RNP, could you walk through that section E and the changes that you've recommended and why? And if there are any board questions, I'd love for board feedback from Mr. Schneidmiller.
Okay. So throughout the RMP, we made revisions to reflect the current policy or practice. We added, for example, the exception to no food and drink rule to allow use of water bottles in extreme heat conditions. That's something that, parents have asked for, regularly, yes, and it just makes sense.
Yes.
we no longer use a parent contract and deleted those references. And we might want to, I don't know that we look at building that back, or we just build the parent communication and set those expectations that way. We also updated the information, as we just spoke of, regarding to lost child, so that it's more clear in policy what those numbers are, and we've got the current numbers in there.
I think perhaps to the parent contract, just having parent notification of transportation expectations. I think that would, a simple statement to that regard would to me be appropriate. Dr. Martin and Ms. Mahaffey.
Yeah, to the RNP, I didn't have a whole lot of question about the content, but the grammar of it, I found awkward, because you start out with, and this is in E1, with an if statement. Two of the bulleted sections follow with an if statement, so you have kind of an if. And
More of a
if we begin with an if, we expect sort of a then. So the first statement, right, if a student has not gotten home in a reasonable time, district operations contact, it doesn't say contact the district operations officer. So if we begin, and I don't care necessarily where it is, just it needs to be consistent. But so if this is an if-then section, then there needs to be an action with each one to clarify. What I didn't see in any of this section was, right, well, I guess the last bullet point under 1 is a little bit what the school system will do. But it felt like as I read through this, the logic didn't make any sense, and I wanted to see if this happens, what's the school system going to do to notify me to take action to do something? And I didn't see that. So I felt that lost child section was both grammatically confusing and didn't give me the reassurance that if this happens, here are the actions that the school system is going to take. So it feels like we almost need an if this happens, here's the actions of the school system, and here's the actions for a parent to make contact. So that would be my recommendation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. I think that's helpful. Ms. Scott, Ms. Mahaffey.
It's
And then Ms.
okay.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No. Because it was actually really, thank you. It was
Okay, Ms.
related
Scott
to
and Ms. Mahaffey.
what Dr. Martin said. I wasn't sure if I would still be here at this point in the meeting, but I also said that in R&P, the section E, that it says contacting the district's operations manager, office is mentioned, but doesn't always state which parties are to do that. And I would agree with Ms. Mahaffey that it is confusing to find. I was just kind of looking at the website to find the whom to call. I don't see anywhere right now, and this is just me glancing at but if I were a parent, frantically, I don't see that anywhere on the website at all, and certainly wouldn't think to go to our policy to look for that. So I appreciate my colleagues referring to just clarification, because that is describing something that's extraordinarily stressful for both the driver and the parent.
Thank you, Ms. Scott. I agree. Yes.
And to Ms. Scott's point, I think there are multiple places where we could put this information. So I think this is the case where if a child is, if a parent does not know where their child is, we want it to make it as easy as possible and as clear as possible how they go about contacting, especially when it's after hours and the folks have gone home. And so not that we expect and not that we have a multitude of children who are, lost on the bus on a daily basis, But when that exception happens, we want to make sure that it is clear how that goes, because I think we all know what that feeling is when, in that moment of panic, whether it's a student, whether it's our own children or a loved one related to us, is, a kid hanging out in the circular rack at the department store.
Yeah.
Right? And very quickly, to the point of the expectations that were earlier, talking about the parent contract, is that something we could put in the handbook that parents have to sign? Because whether it's a field, even if a student is on a field trip, the expectations for riding a bus, while we may not be talking necessarily about bus stops, we do have students who take district transportation during various times of the school year, be it a field trip or what have you. I didn't mean to go from one to the other, but I just figured
Is
I'd
that
ask those
forthcoming?
two separate.
Yeah.
There's nothing that would prohibit that going, in the handbook that goes home. Since the board, and the way I read the board on 6305, that the board wants to retain and reinstate the language about the expectations for parents and students would be communicated. So since that's in there, staff's going to have to come up with a mechanism for that, and certainly taking a look at and seeing whether the handbook is the best way to do it is a reasonable approach on that. And then the other change just on the policy itself was about the bus stops. I just didn't, you all have not approved sending that yet to the full board, just in terms of where you are.
And I'm just looking at the time, I think we are going to lose our quorum at 5, so just to keep that in mind,
That's what I
Dr.
was
Martin. Yeah, thank you.
So overall, I'm fine with the policy, but D is also confusing. D has redundancy with 6315, specifically point 7. That statement is directly in the driver's responsibility, that bus drivers immediately report any suspected mechanical defects. But as I look down through that list, 1 through 7, 1 is about for the drivers. 2 is probably drivers, largely probably the system. 3 is riders. 4 is riders. 5 is drivers. 6 is riders. 7 is drivers. So this section, we're sort of bouncing around expectations between the rider expectations and the driver expectations. It feels to me like the driver should probably be in 6315, and the rider should be here. I understand trying to tie with the School Boards Association, so that does make some sense. So I don't know where we want to land on that, but I find this section confusing, and when I see the two coming together, I agree with Ms. Kushner. Sometimes redundancy is good, but I think in this case, the redundancy is a little bit confusing. So I think at a minimum, we should sort of separate out driver safety issues, rider safety issues, but potentially we ought to look at consolidating the two.
Well, I think, any other feedback? And was this something you want to bring back to policy, or just have further discussion at the board table? You feel?
This is
not
policies.
The policy. Yeah, about the policy.
And again, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just not great.
6305D, I think, as he was talking about section D.
6305D is where there's a lot of, it's confusing, driver versus rider.
I mean,
And we both need to be paying
I see
attention
it,
to safety.
yeah. And I think it's, it's a joint responsibility of safety practices. So I'm okay with it. I see what you're saying, Dr. Martin, but I think, I don't mind it being in
Some of it is
both.
directly driver policy.
Right.
Well,
And I think it's clear, it's important to tell students and parents what the expectations are for both drivers and for riders. So
and adding to the, what's students, what's the driver, the last line of that preamble in D is, in addition to any rules established the expects school employees to observe the following practices. And so I hear what you're saying although I think we all agree that these are all important expectations, it's a little more clarity around who the expectations are for, but it is 4:59.
Yes.
Dr. Martin, do you think the clarity could be addressed just by reorganization within the section of,
I think
maybe
a lot-
put,
Yeah, no, and that's what I'm saying. I mean, all of it's important content. I don't think it communicates well. It's not a reason to hold up passing the policy. I'm not saying that at all. I am reflecting that, right, again, that statement that you just read, Ms. Mahaffey, employees are to observe. So that does make sense. So, but then all riders must be seated. I guess that's an employee expectation to ensure that that is the
Right.
case.
Correct.
Right.
But that also
Right.
is, riders are expected to do this. So to a degree, I think our question is our policy, who's the audience for our policy, and are we communicating that? Is this primarily to the employees? Is it primarily to the riders? And here's where we've got a lot of confusion, and I don't think it's, again, there's nothing wrong with it, it's just not written to the standard that we often like for Wake County policies.
I believe this section is primarily directed to school bus drivers and the expectation to those drivers to monitor students being seated at all times, not being in the stairwell, not being over capacity, using the crossing signal, et cetera. So if it helps, we could reword number 3 to say that
drivers will ensure all riders are.
driver shall ensure all riders are seated while the vehicle is in motion.
Drivers will monitor capacity.
And in the introductory one where it
Yeah.
says the board expects employees to observe, I would just say observe and implement
Sure.
the following practices, because it's not, they are actually also expecting
Yes.
others to do things to make it happen.
And again, we can send the School Board Association our improvements.
Yeah.
you
So
think- are you
my issue is
comfortable-
merely,
Yeah.
let's make the language consistent so it communicates what we're trying to.
I think if we reword how the sentence enters, as
Right.
far as it reads, I think we can address what you're saying. Because it's really about what they're either monitoring or ensuring or how they're operating,
Right.
as far as the drivers themselves.
And if we already decided also that we're keeping number 3 that comes later on about the statement of
Yes.
student expectations and drivers, then we've got another place where we can separate that out.
We're going to reinstate that.
So
I
it's
don't know.
it's understood that the R&P, which is obviously staff's prerogative, does need some work. The board's given a lot of focus on law students. But in terms of the policy itself, the question is whether the committee is at this point prepared to send it to the full board or wants it to come back.
I think I feel comfortable that the corrections that we discussed will be made by the time it comes to the board. So I will make a motion that with the discussed changes, this go to the board upon first reading for approval. And that is policy 6305, safety and student transportation services.
Thank you, Ms. Mahaffey. So there's
be glad to second that.
motion and a second from Dr. Martin. Any further discussion? I think we've given some great clarity. Yes.
There'd be an opportunity for review, and if you found anything you objected to,
Yes.
then we could fix
No,
or
again,
address that time.
there's no objection to content, which is why I'm absolutely happy for it to come. It's really just language and communication.
Yeah, and we can just, we'll bring it to action, so we will have an opportunity to review and openly discuss, and then we can keep working toward these transportation policies that can give some clarity and guidance to parents, students, and drivers. So I
And
think-
often,
thank
as we
you.
do, when we have this number of revisions, when we do first read, we will highlight the revisions that
Thank
we're
you.
bringing back forth that were as discussed in policy committee so that you won't overlook any of them.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner, that's great. All right. And the R&P was for information, but I think we also gave some good feedback for us to refine the R&P, but it is reflecting current practice. And so, yes, ma'am. So there's a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye?
Opposed? Motion carries. And so the final is, again, reflecting School Board Association policy, and we captured some of this in 6300 to start. So this is just a short policy, organization of student transportation services, 6310 that is reflective of School Board Association policy in case they change it or there's some state statute. So it's very short and to the point. Any discussion or feedback? Anything to add, Mr. Steinmiller, Dr. Crane? All right.
We just wanted to point out that the reason we brought this policy back, and I wanted to close with this policy, is because we had some concerns last time that we were going to be striking some things that would be left hanging until another policy was adopted. So we're going to kind of end where we started, or where we ended at the last policy committee meeting, and that we have covered responsibilities of school principals, we've covered responsibilities of transportation district management, and drivers, and students, and parents, et cetera. So we are really now clear to strike this language. And what remains in black is the School Board Association model policy. It's very short, but it is about the organization of student transportation services.
Thank you, Dr. Crane.
You don't need the patch anymore.
Yes, there you go. Thank you, Dr. Crane. So can I entertain a motion to move this policy for final approval on first reading, 6310?
So moved.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. So thanks to Ms. Cash, Ms. Johnsonhossler, Ms. Carter for hanging in there with us. And I think we had great discussion on all policies. Again, parking will come back, and our next meeting has been moved to December 8th, so there will not be a meeting in November, but then we will make up for lost time December 8th. Unless there's any further discussion, this committee meeting is now, thank you all, it'll now be adjourned. Thank you all for the great work.
Thank you.